Welcome to the Harry Bridges School of Labor. Tonight's class will be internal organizing, which is organizing within a union for any job actions or struggles that might happen within a union itself.
Sure. Hi there. Good evening. My name is Daniel. I live in Oregon, and I live way out in the woods in Oregon. So if I leave my camera on, my connection is going to freeze all up. So despite the popular thing, I tend to leave it off, but I like to turn it on at the beginning at least to show that I'm actually here. I'm upright. I'm ambulatory. I'm clothed. I'm a real human at the other end of the computer link, and not just another little rectangle or something. But that said, I am going to turn the camera back off. And if somebody could put up the slideshow, we can get going. So good evening and welcome to the Harry Bridges School of Labor. What we want to talk about tonight is internal organizing. And this class follows on our previous class, which was about external organizing. What's the difference? Well, with external organizing, you don't already have a union and you want to get a union. And you do all this stuff and you build your solidarity and you win a union recognition vote and you sit down with management. Eventually, sooner or later, sometimes management has to be compelled, kicking and screaming, to come to the table and settle a contract. Well, congratulations. Now you have a union. And to rip off some words from Ben Franklin, you have a union if you can keep it. And that's what we want to talk about tonight is internal organizing, keeping the union that you've won or that people who have come before you won and that you've inherited. And it's a lot and it's worth maintaining, it's worth fighting for. We want to talk tonight some about what all that entails. So I guess it reveals my roots a little bit that I like to start with the history. I'm a historian by training, though I've been working with unions and in unions and for unions for many years now. But without going back too far, let's start where kind of our story unfolds, and that is in the 1930s. Prior to the 1930s, there was no legally recognized right to a union in the United States. And so when you look at old labor history, you'll hear a lot about strikes that faced an injunction by a court, and then the police could come in and arrest people and then send the National Guard in and do all this stuff to break up the union and picketing and the other stuff unions do. Well, that changed in 1933, in the depths of the Depression. The Roosevelt administration passed the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. And in it was a clause 7A, that was, for the first time in history, the federal government of the United States recognized the right to join a union and build it, participate in it, do the things a union does. That was 1933. And in 1934, there was a famous wave of massive general strikes all over the United States, where workers who had been fighting sometimes for decades to build unions in their industry got to it. And some of those were general strikes. The longshoremen, famously, particularly on the West Coast, the Teamsters were formed in 1934 with a big general strike in Minneapolis. Mill workers tried to form a union in the South, centered in North Carolina, and that was unfortunately crushed. But those waves of general strikes built a bunch of unions we take for granted today. And because that was so lively, the federal government passed the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. And the National Labor Relations Act is the body of administrative law that the federal government uses to basically regulate labor management relations in the United States. And it encoded certain fundamental rights unions have to exist, to build themselves, to do the things that we do. Now, that was the large print, and it gave it. And World War II came and went. We beat fascism rather gloriously. These are topics for other classes. But after World War II, we did not enter a new era of peaceful cooperation between labor and management. We entered a Cold War that came with a Red Scare. And part of what the federal government did was they passed the Taft-Hartley Amendment to the National Labor Relations Act. It was the fine print that took it away. And it basically contains several takebacks of labor's rights. And just as an example, many of the CIO unions had been built by militant workers of various stripes, very much including communists. Well, the Taft-Hartley Amendment required that unions purge their communists if they were going to be recognized by the federal government. And most of them did, some gladly, some of them wouldn't, and basically got kicked out of the AFL-CIO and were operating without federal support and protection of their rights, which didn't mean they went away. Some examples of that are the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Association, United Electrical Workers. Sooner or later, that stuff mellowed out. But the fact remained that management sort of had the upper hand in labor relations through the NLRA. And that's a situation that has been maintained to this day and over time has been used to significantly corrode union rights. Now, the mechanism that the NLRA uses to recognize unions is the collective bargaining agreement, the CBA, or the contract. And it's been this way for so long that people tend to think the union is the contract and the contract is the union. Well, there's some upsides and some downsides to that. And I want to talk a little bit more about that tonight. Can we get the next slide, please? All right, the contract. So you won union recognition and you have your first contract. What is it that exactly that you have accomplished and what isn't it? It's worth spending a moment on to go a little deeper than the normal conversation. Basically, what the contract does is it regulates a never-ending struggle that always exists between workers and their employers, particularly when you're in a capitalist economy, which is to say you're selling your labor to some entity that is extracting profit from it. They're making more money off you than they're paying you. There's always tensions in that, regardless of anything else going on. And when you have a union, you get a contract, which is kind of like a ceasefire between labor and management for the duration of the contract. Labor wins certain rights or concessions, a minimum wage, maximum hours. It wins some control over working conditions. Some unions go so far as to actually somewhat control hiring, like the longshoremen do. Usually in exchange for a contract, one of the first things management wants is a no strike clause, because your strike is your power to withdraw your labor from the point of production and bring everything to a grinding halt. What management wants out of that contract is labor peace. That's worth bearing in mind. So what a union is doing under the law is it is acting as an exclusive bargaining agent. And what that means is the union becomes your representation at the bargaining table, your voice in a negotiation with management over your wages, hours, and working conditions. And that's worth keeping in mind, because day-to-day struggles go on the shop floor regardless of a contract. A contract is not a magic wand. It doesn't fix everything at work. Part of it depends on management's attitude. Some managers realize that the contract is a good thing and it offers them an opportunity to cooperate with labor to get to win-win solutions, to make everybody happy and get everybody what they need. Other managers are super fragile, touchy, egotistic maniacs who see the contract as a standing insult to their power and they will do everything they can to mess with it and to mess with you and to try and get away with violating it, which means you end up having to enforce the contract. And we're going to talk about more about that in a minute. But it's worth bearing in mind the contract basically is the way that this capitalist system has accommodated organized labor, while keeping it as a commodity. Labor doesn't get to go be in charge of things and start running society or anything wild and radical like that. Your union becomes the agent that is basically handling the sale of your labor to management in exchange for certain rights and dues and things like that. It's a ceasefire in that endless struggle. It's a breathing space that you exist in without having to constantly sneak around and try to organize in secret to try and get what you need. But the contract is not your power. The contract is a representation of your power. The union is your power, working together with your coworkers to stick up for each other and make your lives better at work. That's where your real power is. And just like a strike isn't the totality of your power, it's a tool that you use to exercise the power you already have. Neither is the contract your power. It's a tool that you use to exercise the power that you already have. That may seem like a fine distinction, but the difference is actually profound. And it's worth understanding that, because a lot of people think, well, we got our contract now, so everything's okay, and I'm just going to let the union handle problems, and I'm just going to go about my way. And 50 years of that, and you'll find membership in labor organizations plummeting in your world. So now that we have a handle on what the contract is generally, I wanted to talk about like some problems with contract world and some of the things that can happen because labor relations are framed as a transactional contract between an agent representing your labor and management who's buying it in order to make a profit off it. And some obvious and maybe even classic examples are in order here. For example, you end up with a union bureaucracy that is sort of freestanding, and that bureaucracy is corruptible. Some of those people start seeing they start seeing the side their bread is buttered on as management and not labor. And they become less interested over time in representing their members in their struggles with management, and they become more interested in keeping their workforce docile for the sake of management. Maybe management cuts them in. Maybe they're not actually bribing them, but they're going on vacations together. They're hanging out at the club together. That kind of stuff. So who's administering that contract becomes a very important question. And an example drawn from modern times that people who pay any attention to unions will recognize is the Teamsters have an organization within it called Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And they're exactly an example of a rank and file trying to wrest back control of their union from a relatively corrupt class of business agents. The recognition of management supremacy at the point of production gives the bosses the upper hand. Oh, okay. Here's where I wanted to talk about the management rights clause. Much like I was saying that what management gets out of the contract is labor peace so that they can maximize their profits. You will often find in a contract two clauses. There are union rights and there are management rights. And most unions I've been in, the union rights section runs a page or two, and management rights is maybe a paragraph. Now, if you just judge that by inches taken up on the paper, it looks like, wow, the union has all these powers. But understand the things enumerated in the contract as union powers are limitations. They usually say what the union can do, how far the union can go. And that management rights clause is short and sweet because what it says is we are management. We get to run this place. in our interests. They'll often say, we have the right to run this based on our business needs, first and foremost. And at worst, that kind of clause can be used by management as a kind of get out of the contract stipulations for free. Well, yeah, it says here that we have to like do this equitable hiring process, for example, but, business needs say that we need to employ this child labor for $3 an hour. And that's a real big win for us. So we're not going to let some contract stop us from running the business the way we see fit in order to maximize our profits at the expense of labor, because that's what we're doing here. So that's the thing you got to watch out for with a contract. And then there's the problem of labor as a market. And this is particularly where the federal government comes in. A lot of businesses anymore are interstate, and that's what opens them up to federal jurisdiction. The federal government decided a long time ago that it exists in part to regulate commerce that goes outside of state lines, which is almost everything now. And what that means is labor becomes subject to control by federal legislation. And lawmakers who tend to be capitalists themselves, or certainly serve them, because who gives them more money at election time? Corporations or individual workers or unions. They're not inclined to favor the lower profitability that strong labor unions represent. They are interested in returning value to shareholders, and that value is the excess wealth that they have extracted from your labor. So if you want a great example of problems with this, look no further than the railroad unions, the almost original interstate commerce. They have a whole separate set of federal legislation regulating labor relations in the railroads, because the railroads aren't just interstate commerce. In the 19th century, they facilitated all interstate commerce. When there were no telephones or internets or even cars, if you wanted to ship your product across the country, you put it on a train. And what that meant was they didn't want any train strikes, and they have all these laws to make sure that doesn't happen. We just saw an example of that. Now, over time, what labor wants to do with a contract is like improve the things you go to work to get. Your higher wages for lower hours. You want better working conditions. At some point, you want health care for the kiddos. You want to be able to retire before you're like 80 years old or keel over dead at work. You want life to get better at work over time because you have a union. That is not management's interest almost at all. What they want to do is make the most money out of you for the least amount of money they have to spend on you. That is their modus operandi. So management ends up with this contract that's building up rights over time, and it's costing them more money. They are sorely tempted, and it's very hard for them to resist the idea that let's start poking holes in the contract. Let's start seeing what we can get away with. Maybe we can change a work rule that isn't in the contract that will effectively make everybody work another 5 hours a week that we don't have to pay them for example. So management has the standing impetus to violate the contract. And who's going to save you from that? Like, you could go file an unfair labor practice grievance with the federal government, and an administrative law judge might hear your case 2 or 3 or 5 years later. Meanwhile, you've been working under this odious rule, and some fellow workers tried to do something about it and they got fired. So now there's more unfair labor practice charges that are still waiting years, and management's now poking more holes in it and saying, maybe we can start cutting wages. The contract has to be enforced. We're going to talk about how we do that in a moment. But this is what I mean about a contract is at best a ceasefire in an endless war. Labor always wants better conditions at work, and management always wants more profit out of the workers who are already there. And a contract doesn't change that. It has to be enforced, and it has to be built over time. And just like any battle, it involves advances and retreats. and compromises and strategy, so that really, you know, your contract starts looking like something you want 5, 10, 20 years down the road, while management's always innovating new ways to get out of it altogether. Like, hey, what if we just automate the call center? Then we don't have to pay any of these people anything. No contract, yay. So even a contract still involves endless struggle. Next slide, and/or questions. All right, we're at 1827 Pacific time. So I'm going to try and move through this because I do want to leave enough space for questions, but it's a big topic. What are the elements of the union that exists when you get hired into a shop that's been unionized? Or you've built a union, you won the right to a union, you know, say you're an Amazon worker and you finally beat the Bezos zombies. Yay! What are you looking at? Well, your first question past the contract is membership. And there's a lot to be said about membership. I'm going to try to keep this brief. First thing you got to look at with the bullet is right to work. Maybe you've heard that term and you're not clear what it is. Another way to put that is the open shop versus the closed shop. Same question, different phraseology. What do we mean by that? Well, once upon a time, back when the National Labor Relations Act was passed, it was perfectly permissible to require a new hire to join the union as a condition of employment. That is called a closed shop, where union membership is a compulsory part of the work experience. Well, big business boss types came along and said, well, we don't like that. We'd like to drive a wedge into the workforce. And we got some workers here who are willing to, be our besties and make a loud noise that they're being violated, that their conscience is being trampled by being compelled to join this awful, awful labor union. They just want to work and they have a right to work. This is America. So they started passing laws. And I don't know exactly how many, but a majority of states in the United States are so-called right-to-work states. And what that means is that a new hire is not compelled to join the union just because they got a job in that shop. Now, that should be an obvious threat to any union that exists, because if management just starts hiring a bunch of anti-union people, they can whittle down union membership to a minority and then decertify the union and bye-bye union. So the sort of transitional thing that everybody did was they said, well, okay, people have a right to work without having to join the union, but they're still getting the benefits that the union provides through representation. The union bargains a contract and it wins them raises and it provides stewards and agents and things to help them when they're having problems on the job. So people who don't join the union still have to pay what's called a fair share. They have to pay an equivalent of dues to support the benefits they're getting from the union, even if they're not members. Well, a right to work state is an attempt to make state and federal legislation that gets businesses out of even that much deference to union needs. And then in 2017, this thing happened. A legal case went all the way to the Supreme Court. A fellow named Mr. Janus, I believe it was in Michigan, it might have been Wisconsin, went crying to the courts that it wasn't fair that he had to pay a fair share of a dues equivalent because he didn't like the union and he didn't want to pay for something he didn't like. And the Supreme Court sided with him and said, you know what? You're right. We're not going to make anybody financially support the union, let alone join it in the public sector. And what that did was it immediately threatened public sector unions with being gutted, because this guy didn't have to pay an equivalent of dues. He didn't have to join, but he was still getting all the rights. So why wouldn't I save that 50 or $100 or whatever dues costing if I'm going to get the services of the union anyway, but I don't have to pay for it? Then the union is this like free bauble. It's like a stocking stuffer on Christmas morning. You play with it till it breaks in the afternoon, and then you walk away and you find some other toy. There's a lot that could be said about what happened after Janus was decided and the way that it made public sector unions behave differently. I don't want to go too deep into it, but I do want you to understand that usually, even when you have a recognized union and a contract, that doesn't mean that people have to join the union. So how do you get them to join the union when they don't have to? Well, that's a great question. And it's also an existential question, because a union exists where a majority of the workers want the union. And if they can get the percent of the workforce who want the union down below 50%, they can have what's called a decertification election and make the union go away. So it becomes incumbent on you, the committed union member, to meet the new hires and to welcome them into the union. How are you going to do that? Are you going to have a welcoming committee? Are you going to have a union orientation? Are you going to have a regular meeting or picnic or some kind of way to say, hey, we noticed that you got hired here. We want to welcome you aboard. We also want to welcome you into the union. We're really proud of it. Let me tell you what the union's done for us. And we hope that you'll come along and help us maintain and build this thing because it's good for everyone. And that becomes an important piece of maintaining your union. Now, the other side of that is that there are forces in the worksite and in society who would like to destroy unions altogether, because the only thing they care about is their profits, and unions interfere with that. And in their dream world, we are all chained to our workstations working for dog food. So since they can't just outright crush us with the National Guard like they used to do in the late 1800s, instead, they have this really insidious way of reaching out to union members and saying, hey, why don't you drop your union membership? You know, you could save some money with that and buy the new PlayStation. That would be fun. And you get everything you get with the union, whether you pay dues or not. So why don't you just drop your membership? In other words, there are forces that are trying to corrode your union from without and from within. If I were a boss and I wanted to destroy the union, I'd hire a bunch of anti-union people and get them in there to start whispering things into people's ears about how they should drop out of the union. So how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with the fact that people are going to get pissed off about something that happened 5 or 10 years ago, or something that they heard in the mainstream news, or they just feel like somebody snubbed them at the last meeting and I never get my way when there's a vote, so I'm going to quit. I'm going to stop and you can't make me. You need to be ready to have conversations with those people that are real, that hear their pain, their complaints, and can be like, you know, I'm sorry about what happened to your dad 20 years ago in this other union. That's not what's going on. That's not what's going on here. We need your help to do this thing. So you need to be welcoming new members, and you need to be retaining the members that you do have if you're going to maintain that majority over time. And with that, I'm ready for the next slide, unless you want to do questions. The grievance. All right, we talked earlier about how the contract is only as good as its enforcement, and management is compelled. They have a compelling interest in getting away with everything they can, and that will include violating the contract. And here's a special secret. The more they get away with violating the contract, the more they're going to violate the contract. And they would really love to pay lip service to the contract and not actually honor it at all. So how do you make management behave the way they agreed to manage when they signed the contract? Well, that's what the steward system is all about. And what is a steward? Well, the simplest, most organic form of a steward is it's anybody in the shop who people know, who people trust, who people go to with their problems. like, hey, this manager is sexually harassing me, making like derogatory comments and like always trying to touch my body, and it's icky and I don't like it and I want to stop. What do you think I should do? And anybody who's playing that role is kind of de facto a steward. Within the labor system, however, a steward is that, but more formally. It's somebody who is elected by the members they represent to enforce the contract. Stewards go to trainings where they learn exactly what's in the contract. They learn how the grievance system works, and they hang out at work and people come to them with problems. And sometimes they're like, yeah, sorry, there's nothing we can do about it because we got screwed in the last bargaining session and we lost that right. Or they say, yeah, you know what? That sounds like a contract violation. Let's look at filing a grievance. And if the member and the steward agree that there's probably a violation going on, that steward can then file a grievance that management then has to resolve. And usually the way you resolve it is by making them adhere to the contract. Usually what you've done is you caught them violating an agreement they've already made. So, steward systems and grievance systems look different across unions, but that's the basic idea throughout. Your steward is like your contract sheriff or a contract deputy. They hang out and make sure things are cool. And when things aren't cool, they know the paperwork to file and who to talk to get some action, to get some redress. That's an important function of the union. Without stewards, the contract would be as good as the paper it's written on. Now, that said, there are limits to the contract. A contract is like a contract. Not to sound silly, but it is an agreement between a buyer and a seller for the terms and conditions of the labor being bought. And it only, like any contract, it only goes so far. And beyond a contract is the law. Well, the contract doesn't have the power to override law. The law has the power to override the contract. So there's that whole line, and that points to another limitation of the contract approach to labor rights at work, is you can get some awful state legislature to come in and pass a bunch of laws that override parts of your contract. And that's a drag. And that's why a lot of unions participate in politics, to the point of even supporting candidates that are otherwise icky and they don't like, because they're trying to get the best deal they can in a bad situation by getting more labor-friendly politicians into office and less labor-friendly politicians out of office. That's unavoidable because the law overrides the contract. Now, labor does win rights through law, and some great examples are the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires reasonable accommodation for people with different abilities to be able to participate in society, including work. There is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the idea being that you should not have to work in a toxic pit with no protection for your body. The Environmental Protection Agency, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what that means, it's pretty common that somebody will come to you with a problem at work that you can't do anything about because it's not a question of the contract, it's a question of the law. And so that is how unions get all sucked into the legal system, just like they get all sucked into politics, which seems to take them very far away from the shop floor. What they're trying to do is protect the outer perimeters of this, for lack of a better word, safe space that's been created in the work site by the contract. But the contract only goes so far, and that's worth knowing in advance. Save you a lot of grief and misunderstanding down the road. The final general thing I wanted to say, I mean, many of these could be turned into classes of their own. In this section is, does the shoe fit on the other foot? Can the boss grieve you? Short answer, hell no. But that doesn't mean they won't try. I hear stories all the time of the bosses saying to workers without a steward or a representative of the union present, hey, what you're doing violates the contract and I'm going to get you into trouble if you keep it up. Well, guess what? The contract does not exist as a tool for the bosses to discipline their workforce with. If a manager has a problem with somebody's behavior and it's union related, they can go talk to an officer or a steward or a representative. They cannot file a grievance against you. If they think the union is being unfair in the workplace, they can file an unfair labor practice charge with the National Labor Relations Board, who in 2 or 3 or 5 years will hear it, just like we can do that too. But the contract system brings justice a little closer to home at work, and it's also got some limitations. The boss cannot grieve you, not like that anyway. Doesn't mean they won't try.
Okay. So there's a lot I have to say on this. I'll just hit the last point for now. Something from the last slide. Always remember, no agreement, even if there's a backroom agreement between your union president and your boss, it can't override labor law. I could give an example. We have an issue going on right now where my union president agreed to push for increasing worker availability for the transit authority here. And part of that is they created this, they call it Care and Aware program. Well, the boss will bring you in, they'll go over your record, and they'll tell you need to increase your availability. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but there's one thing they can't even look at, and that's FMLA, which is another one of these few laws we got passed in favor of workers, called the Family Medical Leave Act. It's protected time. As long as you have the proper paperwork filed, you could take 60 days, a year, unpaid, or if you have time to use it. And the boss can't touch you. They can't even think about it. The only thing
Unless you're a railroad worker, but not to digress.
They can't touch you. They can't discipline you in any way. Well, now we got bosses at my workplace being called in. We got workers being called in and told if they don't improve their attendance, and they've only taken FMLA, that they threaten violations. Can't do it. And most of the union representation at my place is going along with it. We have one guy fighting it. And hopefully soon we'll have more. But that's not for here or there. But just keep in mind, labor law, you can't circumvent labor law with an agreement, especially if it's an agreement the members didn't vote on. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. So yeah, on the last point, especially with grievances. So I'm one of 2 stewards in my workplace. The union I'm in, they represent different public sector workers across 5 different states. Most of them are in large service centers. I'm in a small little office compared to them. But basically the law is, there are processes and there are things that can help, but do kind of keep in mind it's still kind of skewed in favor of the businesses and the bosses, because it's a long drawn out process. They want you to lose hope or just to drop it at any point because it's such a process. Like, for example, if there's a grievance to be filed, we first have an informal process that you have to file. You have to first contact what we call, it's a different agency called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The grievance had to have taken place within 30 days. And then after you talk to a counselor, you have 3 days to fill out an informal grievance filing, where basically that counselor either will do some mediation or they do a short investigation. And if you're not satisfied with that outcome, then they start the formal filing process, which again, there are certain timelines also you have to keep in mind, like either if it's 30 days or for some grievances, there's a step 1 where we go to up to a certain level of management. And if that doesn't resolve it, then there's a 2, then a 3. And then finally we could like elevate it with a federal or a department or something. It's insane, but don't lose hope. There's a lot of processes and a lot of dates to remember, but never lose hope.
Absolutely. And the main thing, my main concern about this class is I'm going breathlessly through vast bodies of material. Any one of these slides could be turned into a whole class. We could have a whole class on stewards, on grievances and things like that. These are complex, complicated issues. And they're even more complicated lived in the real world because every union has a different contract, right? I'm just trying to introduce these general concepts, but it's worth thinking about down the road. Maybe we should be doing classes on these particular topics. And I'm sure a lot of us have a lot to offer experientially with things like this.
Yeah, so one little book that's a good reference guide I like to have on hand by Daniel Gross, Strutton Lind, Labor Law Off the Ranks and Files. It's not a end all do all, but it does have some guidelines of this is the federal laws that can actually protect you in the workplace. And if you have issues with management, this is some of the things that you can actually reach out and do. It's a nice little handy book.
And we'll go to the rest of the presentation.
And I'll try to move through it relatively tersely so we have a little room for discussion at the end. But these are big topics. So my apologies that I sound a little breathless trying to get this out. It's a lot to wrangle. But look at the alternative of there being no unions at all, which is how many of our ancestors lived. So it's definitely better than the alternative, looking backwards into history at least. Lastly, I believe this is the last slide. I wanted to talk about unity and its discontents. Unions have a lot to offer, and they're also a lot of work. And there are a lot of unpaid work. There are a lot of additional work. They rely on volunteers and something of a paid bureaucracy who tend to develop their own interests over time. So how do you keep the crew together? How do you keep the union not just existing, but functional, coherent, living, breathing, and serving your interests as workers? There's a few things to think about in terms of that question, and it is in some ways the most important one of all. First and foremost, at the risk of sounding a little bit ideological here, you have all the power at work because you're doing the work that produces the profit that bosses are there and very interested in extracting from your labor. And your ultimate power at work is to stop working so that the boss can no longer make money off of you until your demands have been satisfied. That's also known as a strike. So along those lines, every now and again, even when you have a union, you have to go on strike to defend the contract and to make gains in the contract over time. And I've already talked about how the union contract isn't a magic wand. It doesn't fix all your problems. You do that, and the contract is a tool that you use to do that. But that said, the contract is no better than you are strong. Or in other words, you get the best contract that your power can win. And so in that sense, the contract isn't just a receptacle of your power, it's a reflection of it. And when a union is growing, when its members are engaged, when people are paying attention to what's going on, taking it seriously, speaking out, acting up, the union becomes very powerful. And when members sort of take a passive consumerist approach to membership, I call it the union as AAA. Well, I pay my dues, and then when I get a flat, you come tow me, but otherwise I'm not obligated really to do anything, certainly not after working hours, because I have my family and I have my life and I don't want to go to a meeting at night. Well, that is over time going to be corrosive to the union's power. It's not going to be as strong. It's not going to be as coherent, and management knows that, and they'll take advantage of that. Believe you me, whether members are paying attention or not, management is paying very close attention to the union, and they're looking for weak spots because they'd like to shove some shivs in and see if they can take down the union. And so it is imperative that you maintain not just membership, but like an esprit de corps, a feeling of camaraderie, that we're in this together and we fight for each other, and that's how we win. And with that, you can overcome pretty much any obstacle. But without that, the best contract in the world isn't going to save you. Along the lines of the bosses looking for weak spots to shiv you in, a time-honored tradition going back thousands of years is the boss will always try to stoke divisions, sometimes flagrantly. And the classic examples are racism. Sometimes it's softly. They'll use the rhetoric of empowerment. The bosses of the people I work for, the union I work for, talk a really good game about EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And they can talk like the most progressive politicians you've ever met about everybody getting a fair shot and uplifting and empowering people to build resilience and excellence and leadership. And you know what? At the end of the day, they're still doing the same harassments, trying to get people overworked for as little money as possible, that they cover up with the rhetoric. So whether it's hard or whether it's soft, the bosses are going to look for those divisive wedges and try to shove them into the workforce. Why? So that members start arguing with each other about who has it better or worse, instead of coming together in their common interest to get a better contract by getting a leash on the boss's worst behaviors. So how are you building that community that is resilient enough to overcome the boss's attempts to drive divisions in you? Maybe only certain people get promotions. Maybe management has an established track record of only promoting besties. Maybe there's an despotic element to it. Well, you have to be related to them or a friend if you want to get a raise or go anywhere. I keep hearing stories that at Panda Express, you have to join the Landmark Forum if you want to become like a shift manager. They have this whole cult thing going on. What if you don't want a cult at work? Well, they also don't have a union. So there's no way to stop that division of the workers into like basically star-bellied sneetches versus plain sneetches, and who's going to get the advantages. Your union has to watch out for that, because that's deadly. And part of that too is, look, not to be all up on my little soapbox, but like unions are one of the last places in this country that are like great social watering holes. People from the entire spectrum of reality are working next to you, because the union's not hiring people, management is. And they are hiring radicals, and they are hiring Trumpists, and they are hiring Christians and Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and this whole giant spectrum of society. And so in a real way, the boss is picking who's in the union because they're choosing who to hire. And so how are you going to build a mutual understanding and tolerance between that incredibly diverse workforce, especially when everybody goes home to their preferred media and listens to all these stories about how awful those other people over there are, who are actually your coworkers. So one of the things we have to do is build a real tolerance. And that includes the people's quirks and foibles and weird things that you're uncomfortable with. Are there extremes beyond the pale? Absolutely. I'm never going to be comfortable working next to somebody I know is a racist Klan poo head. But on the other hand, if somebody goes to kind of a weirdo church that I'm uncomfortable with, is that really enough to make me hate them more than I want to find out some way to work with them in solidarity to make all of our working lives better? We need each other. We need the strength that all of us coming together offer. And part of what we can do is be a little more tolerant of each other, and particularly where we make each other uncomfortable, because that's not going to change anytime soon at work. And lastly, I do believe is one of my favorite sayings: he or she who despairs of herding cats has never used an electric can opener. if you have cats and you have an electric can opener and you use that electric can opener to open up the wet food the kitty wants, watch those cats come running. The best way to draw a crowd, and this is kind of like nothing succeeds like success, the best way to draw a crowd is to provide that crowd what it wants. And what do people want at work? Why do they even go to work? They want good pay, reasonable hours, and good working conditions. They want to send their kid to ballet school. They want to go to the dentist. They want to take care of their ailing, fragile parents. They want to be able to take care of themselves and their families by going to work. And to the degree that the union can play a prominent part in providing that, people will be drawn. Even non-members, even sort of standoffish, well, I don't really like, this Jimmy Hoffa, like just nonsense. Whatever it is they picked up in the movie or on the news about how awful unions are, they want the good pay. They want that healthcare. I've never heard of anybody turning down the healthcare that the union won them. So find that can opener and run it. Feed those kitties and watch them come running. And that's an important part of maintaining your union. I guess that wasn't the last slide, but we are at time, aren't we? I'm willing to go on or stop, but that's not my call. I think that'd be a good enough place to stop.
Joe, we started about 5 minutes late. Do we still have time to go with the
All
last
right.
2 slides?
All right, let's go through this again rather breathlessly. And right along the lines of what I've been saying is the interference of liberal conservative politics. And I'm almost just reading the slides here. Both main parties have a form of pretending to serve the interests of working families, but each have a way of stabbing labor in the back in the group hug. With the Republicans, they do this very performative thing about manufacturing. Trump promised to bring back all those good manufacturing jobs to Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and won those states. And of course, anybody who read the tag in the MAGA hat knew it was made in China, but Trump touched something there. And, I think a lot of those people were disappointed to find out that the president isn't actually in charge of those things. The Democrats, for their part, Joe Biden talks a great game about being the most pro-labor president in 50 years and stabbed those railroad workers in the back who were trying to get sick days. They're being made to go into work sick, coming out of COVID. So, a great way to get a heated argument going on in your union meeting is to bring up liberal conservative politics. But you got to keep in mind that both of these parties are posers. Neither of them are really there to serve our interests. They are there to serve the interests of the corporate donors. And what the corporate donors want is return of value to shareholders, which is to say the money they made off you going into somebody else's pocket. The capitalists use all that they can to try and dominate or monopolize certain economic things. And sooner or later, they use the law to come after organized labor, because even when your union is strong and it's fighting and it's winning and it's building that contract, they can get around it with the law. So they do that, and they make legal attacks on maybe not unions per se, but all of the elements I've been describing of how a union operates in this kind of society. And so we can never rest on our laurels. We always have to be willing to fight further, harder, and more, not even to make gains, but just to continue to exist. And the best tool we have for that kind of long-term fight is a culture of solidarity. Once upon a time, people lived in ethnic enclaves. They worked within walking distance of where they lived. Everybody in the neighborhood worked at the same factory. And what do you know? There were strong, resilient unions in those communities. And then the 50s and 60s happened, and white flight, and everybody moved out to the suburbs, and they're living in these little prison homes and don't even know their neighbors. They drive into work. Everybody's radically detached. And then television came along, and then the internet came along, and now nobody knows anybody around them. So How do you build a culture of solidarity in a population that is that atomized? That's a real problem. And then on top of that, people are atomized, they're isolated, and then they're accosted with an endless array or endless parade of crises, whether that is gas prices or COVID or the loss of healthcare or whatever it is. People end up living these lives of quiet desperation. They just accept their plight or their fate because it could be worse. They could be homeless. Maybe they are homeless and still working, but at least they're working. At least they have a car to live in. So, like, when somebody is in that mentality, when they're in that mindset, they're not real open to this appeal to these broad ideals of solidarity and progress over time by struggling together. They're like, yeah, I'm worried about feeding my kids tomorrow. How are you going to answer that? And those are places that rhetoric just can't take you. What can move people in a situation like that is feeling like the people they work with give a shit about their fate. And pardon the French, but it's really that simple. Where we build a community of people who actually care about what happens to each other, that isolation starts breaking down, and that desperation starts having a place to reach out to for help. And then people start seeing each other not as competitors or not as other isolated atoms bouncing around the beaker. They start seeing each other as a community. And that community is the basis of your solidarity. And when people are feeling that, they are unstoppable. But it takes a lot to get them to feel that. It's beaten down and overworked and wrung out and desperate as people are right now. It's very easy for people to say, you know what? I got problems of my own. I don't need the union's problems as well. But when the union's strong and can help you solve your problems, well, there's your electric can opener. So don't neglect the community building part just because you got an eye on the contract, and you should have an eye on the contract. But that community is where your real power lives. It's where it breathes. It's where it grows. And if you have that, you are unstoppable, whether your union is recognized by management or not. But without that, it doesn't matter how good your union looks on paper. It will fall apart at first touch. So yeah, these last two slides kind of reiterated some other things, but I think they were worth emphasizing. Thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it.
And just a little recommendation to the end of this class. I recommend if everybody could go, there's a good book on the formation of a union that's very strong with their rank and file organizing. And they pride themselves on being rank and file led. That union is the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers. If you visit their website, ueunion.org, you can find a book called Them and Us. It's on their struggles, on their formation. And also with that, they have a little pamphlet. I recommend getting that as well. It's called Them and Us Unionism. And this is something everybody should have in their workplace. And anybody that's a union member or looking to form a union, follow this guide and work to improve your union if you already got one. And if you don't got one, use this guide because the union is the members. It's one thing we always need to remember. A union is only as strong as its weakest member. And with that, we're going to close out with the song Join the CIO.
I'm a union woman, just as brave as I can be. I do not like the bosses, and the bosses don't like me.